There it is.
Okay, there it goes. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And I'm anticipating some more people trickling in now that it's 6 o'clock. But I just wanted to get started since we have a full agenda today and we've got an hour and a half. So thank you all for your time. My name's Alejandra Narvaez. I'm the Coastal Project Manager for the Trustees of Reservations. And I've been co-project managing this project with Jen Carberg from Nantucket Conservation Foundation. So as a little bit of background to this project, this work that we'll be presenting on today and that GZA, our consulting team who's here today, will be presenting on is a series of a lot of previous work, including a lot of site assessments, site prioritization efforts, and a lot of previous modeling and data collection that has led to this point. And our overall goal as the two organizations that are co-managing this refuge is to figure out ways that we can build resilience into these particular sites, specifically Coskata Pond and the Hall Over, which have been identified as the two most vulnerable areas within the refuge, both to flooding, to erosion, and also to a potential breach on the refuge, which would allow the open exchange of water between Nantucket Harbor and the Atlantic Ocean. As many of you might know, there's a history of breaching at the Hall Over in the late 1800s, which took about 12 to 13 years to close. And during that period, we saw obviously a lot of erosion and changes to the habitat. And so what we really want to do here is build resilience to an event such as that, but also just in general, daily flooding and erosion to these particular sites, both in terms of trail flooding to maintain oversand vehicle access, but also just to reduce the amount of sediment that we lose on the barrier beach and to reduce the amount of habitat that we're losing. These are really ecologically significant areas, being a wildlife refuge. So that's really what we're aiming for here. We're aiming to address both short-term issues like trail flooding, but also long-term issues like habitat migration and wildlife habitat. So what we've really asked GZA to do here is to build off of all of that work that we've done previously and that we've worked with other consultants and universities, as well as our internal staffs to do, is basically create preliminary designs for these two sites that will be something that we can take on to the next phase of work and that are based primarily on nature-based solutions. So we'll go a little bit into what that means, but basically the bottom line is we're not looking at heavily engineered gray infrastructure in these areas. This is a wildlife refuge, and so we want to really maintain the integrity of these habitats and use both coastal processes and the natural processes, sorry, my phone, that are happening in these areas to increase the overall resilience as a whole. So that's really what we've asked them to do. And we really encourage you today to ask questions throughout the meeting. They're going to be presenting, building off of our last public meeting, which happened in late 2024, and they'll be presenting our preferred alternatives by each site. One of the things you'll notice is that we heard the community in our previous public meeting, and therefore we actually incorporated the Coskata Woods Trail as one of the sites that we were looking at, even though it wasn't one that originally we set out to assess. So I really encourage you to ask questions throughout, either through the Zoom chat or through the Menti board, which we'll introduce a little bit later on. But always feel free to reach out. I'll follow up with an email for everyone who registered for the meeting later. So you can always respond to that with more questions. We'll be available, and I'll let Jen introduce herself, and if there's anything else you want to add, Jen.
Sure. Thanks, Alejandra. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming and joining us this afternoon, especially when we know the weather is so spectacular outside. I'm Dr. Jen Carberg. I'm Director of Research at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. And those of you interested in coastal resilience on Nantucket have probably seen me at our CRAC meetings, our Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee meetings. This work is very important to both the foundation and the refuge. The resiliency of the refuge is identified as one of the things that we needed to pay attention to in our coastal resilience plan that the town of Nantucket focused on a few years ago. We recognize the importance of the refuge for so many reasons, biggest of course, and with our priorities at the foundation is the ecological importance and the beauty and the uniqueness of the refuge and protecting that. but also recognizing the importance that that barrier beach plays for creating the harbor that is Nantucket Harbor. It wouldn't exist without the refuge, without that barrier beach, and trying to understand how we can maintain the resilience, maintain the ability of that barrier beach to stay in place, to roll, to move and change with changing climate, while also protecting, the ecological value and hoping to get people out there, maintaining a way that the public can access this really unique and special place. So that's why the two organizations have gotten together. We own different portions of the refuge. For those of you that might not have looked at our property map, the Conservation Foundation owns some of the beginning portions of the Hullover and then also out on Coatue, while the Trustees owns areas at Coskata Pond and up to Great Point. So in order to get to either of our properties, you have to cross over the other organization's properties. So we try and think about how we're going to respond to impacts of climate change and just change out on the refuge in parallel together. So that's what this work is focused on. And those of you that go out to the refuge, I'm sure can think of some areas that maybe washed over this past weekend, some other areas that you think are less resilient on the refuge. We've chosen these two particular spots after quite a bit of work and digging into what's happening on the refuge, partly because they're so key to both of our organizations and access to both pieces of property. If we lose access or connection at the Hullover and or the Coskata Pond at the East Beach, then you lose access to the entire refuge. So we're focusing right now on these two areas together. And that's what we've asked our consultants to do, and to really dig into what's happening out here, to use the science and the research to help inform us to how we can best respond to change and keep what's really special about the refuge intact. So again, thank you all for joining us. And for those of you still coming in, as Alejandra said, if you have questions as we go, please put them into the chat and there'll be time at the end. But also we have a way for you to interact with us as we move through the presentation, and you can ask questions there also. That's what I have. Thanks, Alejandra.
Thanks, Jen. And with that, I'll pass it on to Maria and Matt, if you want to introduce yourselves and start sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I started sharing. Can you see my screen, Alejandra?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so hello, everyone. Good evening. It's truly inspiring to see so many of you here tonight demonstrating your shared passion for Coskata-Coatue Wildlife Refuge. I am Dr. Maria Puntiki. I work as a project manager for GZA GeoEnvironmental, and I have the pleasure to work with Mr. Matt Page, who is associate principal in GZA, and Mr. Dan Stapleton, who is senior consultant. Matt is here with us today, and we've been working on this project for a while, as Jen and Alejandra mentioned, because we know that our coastal environment is dynamic, constantly reshaping itself, and the impacts of sea level rise are becoming increasingly apparent. So this evening, we are excited to share the culmination of extensive research and a truly collaborative effort between the trustees of reservations, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and our technical team in GZA GeoEnvironmental, and present a robust coastal resilience plan for Coskata-Coatue. So here is what we will cover today. We will begin with a brief recap of our site assessment. Then we will explore the unique challenges and proposed mitigation strategies. From there, we will share preliminary design concepts and open the floor for discussion. After we present each measure at its respective examination site, we will pause. We will pause for a brief 5-minute break. And during these pauses, we invite you, the audience, to actively participate by answering some targeted poll questions. So our study focuses on 3 zones within the refuge: the Coskata Pond, the Coskata Woods, and the main Hullover trails, and the Hullover harborside shoreline. This isn't just about losing a few feet of beach. It's about safeguarding vital habitats, protecting popular trails that are increasingly underwater, and ensuring public access to the sites, so people can enjoy these beautiful natural spaces. But more critically, we are working to prevent a potential breach that would have dramatic and far-reaching impacts, not just for the refugees peninsula itself, but for the entire town of Nantucket. We know that this system is eroding and it will continue to erode, but our goal is to protect it and allow continued enjoyment and retain public access for as long as possible. So GZA's approach is grounded in adaptive management and long-term sustainability. We are essentially using a data-driven framework to guide near-term planning in actionable 5-year cycles. And this allows us to remain flexible and responsive to changing conditions, while ensuring that our interventions are both ecologically sound and community informed. Now, let me elaborate on how we achieve this and what truly sets our GZA project approach apart from previous efforts. Our approach is built on 4 key pillars. First, we embrace natural processes, which is fundamental because we recognize that coastlines are dynamic systems, and our plan allows for natural erosion and shoreline changes. And critically, we avoid interventions that would disrupt those natural coastal processes. This is a significant departure from some of the traditional thinking you might have heard about, like extensive beach nourishment or large-scale sand fences, etc. Which those ideas, while those ideas have been proposed in the past, they often fight against the very nature of this coastline and have proven to be largely ineffective and unsustainable here. Secondly, we focus on small-scale localized solutions because instead of grand sweeping projects, we are looking at targeted interventions that address challenges in a precise and adaptable way. And thirdly, we prioritize natural and nature-based features. And this is where we want to get really innovative because we are leveraging the existing coastal resources and utilizing solutions that work with nature and not against it. So this is a core part of how we differentiate ourselves from previous consultants who in the past suggested more engineered, let's say, solutions. Finally, we rely on proven techniques because while we are innovative, our solutions are grounded in methods that have already been demonstrated successful in similar dynamic coastal environments. So now underpinning all of this is our core principle of adaptive management. First, we acknowledge uncertainty as we know that these coastlines are constantly changing and there is no single permanent fix. So we embrace that as a reality. Secondly, we will be monitoring and evaluating the implemented measures because this will allow us to adjust our strategies based on the data we collect and what we learn. We can modify our plans as needed. So this approach is absolutely vital for long-term success on the refuge. And this brings us to a long-term commitment. Our work here is not a one-off project. It's about continuously monitoring, evaluating, and adjusting to achieve the best possible results for the refuge. So the project implementation began with the Metocean data analysis and drone-based site reconnaissance. I'm going to show photos from our drone-based survey later on. And our supplemental site assessment included shoreline change analysis, coastal resource mapping to identify ecological assets, geomorphological tracking from historical data, future shoreline projections under sea level rise scenarios, and finally hazard modeling for dune collision, overwash, and inundation. So as we transition from assessment to action, we're focusing on 2 critical trail systems, the Coskata-Coatue and the main Hollover Trail. So these trails, the Coskata-Coatue Trail and the main Hollover Trail, are not just pathways. They are essential arteries providing public access to the northern parts of the refuge. But unfortunately, their integrity is increasingly at risk, and their preservation is of critical importance for public access. So the reality is that the low-lying interior, the low-lying interior areas of the peninsula are naturally becoming more and more a part of the tidal marsh system. And this is due to ongoing tidal flooding from the inlet. So this natural process, combined with high-frequency storm floods, will continue to erode the existing land formations. So the most visible consequence of this process is the frequent flooding of our existing trails and OSV roads, including the Coskata-Coatue Trail and most critically the North-South Hollover Main Trail. As you can see on the maps here, we've identified 3 primary issues directly impacting these trails. At point A, we are observing flooding even in what seem like higher elevation areas. And this is due to poor drainage and blocked flow paths. Like here. And then at point B is essentially a low-lying trail with segments that are experiencing persistent inundation during high tides. And at point C, we see erosion which not only degrade the trail, but also exacerbate water retention, making the problem even worse. So this side-by-side image captures the contrasting flood conditions along 2 critical access routes within the refuge. So on the left, we see the Coskata-Coatue Trail, where water pooling has created a large puddle, indicating poor drainage and low-lying topography. So here we see Jen, Diane, and Alejandra. Literally, the water was so deep, almost at the knees of Diane. And on the right, the main Hollover Trail is shown inundated. The trail is submerged with signets partially underwater, illustrating the severity of tidal flooding and the urgent need for adaptive trail design. We performed flood analysis and created maps that highlight the vulnerability of low-lying trail segments, many of which are already intermittently flooded. So the map is based on mean high water benchmarks and uses a color-coded system to illustrate the extent of flooding over time. Black color represents the current mean sea level, serving as our baseline. Yellow shows the current mean high water elevation at 1.27 feet, highlighting areas already experiencing regular tidal influence. Orange indicates a +1 foot increase above current mean high water, projecting conditions around 2040 with an elevation of 2.27 feet. And the red represents a +2 foot increase above current mean high water, forecasting conditions by 2070 at 3.27 feet. And to truly understand the urgency and the necessity of an adaptive approach, we can also look at the long-term trail flooding scenarios. This slide presents a visual comparison. On the left, you see the present conditions for flooding, and on the right, you see a projection for 2050. Areas in red indicate locations that are projected to experience daily flooding by 2050. Orange shows areas that would be flooded during a 10-year storm event. Yellow represents flooding during a more extreme event, which is like the 100-year storm event. And the light blue lines are the trails. Essentially, it highlights the roads that are projected to be flooded daily if no measures are taken. So our proposed alternative is to raise the trail grade in vulnerable segments using a 50-50 blend of oyster shell and sand, because this material was selected for its permeability, durability, and ecological compatibility, because it supports drainage while resisting compaction and erosion. And it also aligns to our natural and nature-based solutions and thought process. Here we've mapped the proposed fill areas along the Coskata-Coatue Trail. These segments range from 33 to 70 feet in length and vary in width depending on the terrain. The design is informed by current and projected conditions from 2025 to 2030, and it ensures that we are planning for near-term resilience while maintaining flexibility for future adaptation. The main Hollover Trail presents a larger scale challenge with over 1,600 feet of trail requiring intervention. The widths vary from 20 to 40 feet, reflecting the trail's role as a primary access route. These areas are particularly vulnerable to overwash and tidal flooding, and our design aims to elevate and stabilize them without disrupting the surrounding dune and marsh areas. So this is a cross-section that illustrates our proposed trail profile, and we can fill existing ruts and low-lying areas with up to 28 inches of the sand oyster shell mix, topped with a 3 to 4 inch sand layer for surface stability. The final trail elevation will range from 4 to 4.25 feet, comfortably above the mean higher high water, which is currently 1.6 feet. And this design is representative and will be adapted, of course, to site-specific conditions along the trail. So with that, I would like to make a small break and allow Alejandra to share her screen, her monitor, and you have the opportunity to answer some of our questions. Sounds good. Is it okay, my screen, Alejandra?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So let's stay now at the Hollover area and move slightly west of the Hollover Harbor side. So the Hollover Harbor side shoreline is made up of low-lying barrier beach and marsh, and it includes a tidal inlet, a narrow land strip, and a low line of dunes. This shoreline is eroding, and that dune line is not holding essentially. If this dune system disappears, tidal flooding will increase in the low-lying areas behind it, leading to rapid erosion, and the whole system will transform into a tidal flood. So we need actions that can reduce the speed of this long-term transformation. Our analysis has identified 3 interrelated issues. The first one is the dune breaches, which compromise the natural barrier protecting the inland habitats. Here is a photo we took on our site visit last July, and it shows the absence of dunes at some areas along the Hollover Beach and at the harbor side. So using mass CZM transects, we conducted a detailed dune analysis to quantify the extent of morphological change. And these transects provide a longitudinal view of dune evolution and breach vulnerability. So the data confirms that the shoreline is retreating and that the protective dune system is fragmenting, especially in areas where vegetation has been lost or where overwash events have occurred. So here we see the dune crest in 2010 and how the dune crest decreased and retreated on shore in 2024. So this is the 2024 dune crest. You see how much lower it is, making it easy for the waves to overwash the area and overtop the dunes. This flood map visualizes projected inundation scenarios for the Hollover area under current and future sea level conditions, as I explained in the previous slide. Again, the map is based on mean high water benchmarks and uses a color-coded system to illustrate the extent of flooding over time. The second issue we identified at the Hollover Harbor side is the saltwater inundation that leads to the loss of freshwater dependent ecosystems. And this is evident in the area we see here. We named this area Dead Forest area because it used to be a very nice green vegetated area, and all vegetation has died off and was burned by the saltwater intrusion, as you can see on the photos here. The photos were taken again last summer, so they're pretty recent. The third issue we identified at this area is the accelerated shoreline erosion that is driven by the sea level rise and the intensified coastal processes. And these changes signal a weakening of the natural infrastructure that protects the refuge and surrounding communities. So here we see the breaches that have already occurred. These breaches were not existing at the site a few years ago. They started small and they keep becoming bigger and bigger. So in the next photos, we can see several views of the whole over area. We've taken those photos during our drone survey. They're they're of high resolution, pretty detailed. We can see the bridge here. This is the dead forest area, that was inundated at that point. A closer view, you see sediments come in, sediments go out, but unfortunately they don't stay and they don't help. Everything that comes in goes out, and it doesn't help build up higher elevations within the system. So we want to take actions to help the system rebuild itself and catch up with the sea level rise. This is a closer view of this bridge. And we move on. So given the challenges we've discussed, you might be asking, what can we do? And this brings us to a key component of our strategy, the implementation of living shorelines. And the core principle behind the living shoreline is simple. We work with nature's own processes to build resilience instead of fighting against them. So how does this work? Imagine structures like oyster castles or reefs placed strategically offshore. These elements act as wave attenuators. They break the force of incoming waves before they reach the shoreline. And this creates a calmer water zone behind them. In these calmer waters, another process begins, which is the sediment accretion. And the reduced wave energy allows sand and other materials to settle and build up. So this process can help to widen the beach, and over the time, this natural buildup can also help the system to keep pace with sea level rise, essentially building itself up vertically, as I said before. Farther inland, we can integrate marshes, like here. These natural systems with their dense root structures provide soil stabilization, and they hold the land in place and prevent it from washing away. So together, these components, the reefs and the sediment buildup and the marshes, work to slow down the coastal processes like erosion, and they create a more stable and resilient system. And this is a cross-section of the suggested measures and design. So we see this is the current dune crest. We start with the active vegetation and marshes. We have the oyster castles as the most landward defense line against flooding. Some extra vegetation, and then we have the oyster reef balls farther offshore. I forgot to mention in the previous slide that in the area there are already eelgrasses, and the suggested living shoreline, of course, will not interfere with them. I mean, it will not bother them, it will not disrupt them. In the contrary, it will help them become bigger and wider. So
Maria, sorry, before moving forward, I figured this is a good question to address right now. I wonder if you could just say a couple sentences about what reef balls are and what their purpose is as they design.
Of course. Thank you so much, Alejandra.
Thank you, Kate.
It's difficult to keep an eye on questions while I'm presenting. Thank you. So reef balls is what we see down here, actually. So imagine they are concrete balls with holes, and these holes allow the marine life to start creating communities inside them. And also they act as wave attenuators. So as the waves come from offshore, they find them, so they meet shallower waters due to the existence of the reef balls. They break, and then we have smaller waves going farther on shore. And as I explained, smaller waves are what we want to achieve in order to achieve the sediment accretion and a wider beach. So reef balls is what we have here. It's, I can delete all my drawings. Yeah, so reef balls is what we present down here. Concrete balls with holes that act as wave attenuators.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you. So I'll be spending a bit more time on this slide as it outlines a key component of our resilience strategy for the whole over shoreline at the harbor side. So for this side, we suggest a two-pronged approach designed to restore marsh stability and ecological function. First, we are implementing active plantings using native species that are well adapted to Nantucket's coastal conditions. And these include spartinas that are known for their robust root system and tolerance to saline inundation, and which also form dense mats ideal for upper marsh stabilization, as well as salt marshes and salt grasses, both of which enhance plant community diversity and soil cohesion. So for active vegetation, essentially we suggest something that already exists and we need to boost, like spartina, salt marshes, and salt grasses. Secondly, we're introducing micro to small scale topographic enhancements. So this includes creating hummocks and shallow depressions to increase the habitat heterogeneity, slow surface water flow, and promote sediment deposition and plant colonization. And to further reinforce the soil structure, we are incorporating soil hardening techniques. This includes the implementation of biochar, which improves soil porosity, water retention, and nutrient availability while sequestering carbon. Crushed shell amendments from local oyster and clam sources, which buffer soil acidity and support calciphilic plant species. And the third option is the mycorrhizal fungal inoculation, which enhances the root development and soil aggregation through some symbiotic relationships with native plants. And all these, the biochar, crushed shell amendments, and mycorrhizal fungal inoculation will be obtained from local sources again. We don't want to introduce anything from outside. And moving on to Coskata Pond, before moving on, let's make another stop here for extra questions. Okay, awesome. So Coskata Pond is a dynamic and vulnerable area within the refuge. Most of you, of course, already know, have already visited, but the area has undergone significant geomorphic and ecological changes. So it's essentially the area is a striking example of how barrier systems evolve under pressure. And here is what we see. First of all, we've seen dune overwash, where storm-driven waves transport sand inland and offshore, of course, but we will see later that most of it goes towards the west. We've seen also dune retreat and migration that reduce the protective buffer between the ocean and the pond. Replacement of tidal marshes with overwash deposits, which vary the critical habitats and alter the hydrology. Shoreline erosion in general, that is exacerbated by the sea level rise, and loss of habitats that are caused particularly by the losses of the marshes. So these processes are all interconnected and accelerating, threatening both the ecological integrity and the physical stability of the barrier system. So these historical aerial images from 2009, and later on I'll show photos from 2014 and 2019, illustrate the transformation of the Coskata Pond area over just a decade. So you can see the expansion of overwash deposits, which have buried fringe marshes. So you see how it was before and how it was in 2014. Now it is even worse. We also see like the fringe marshes here in 2009, and by 2019 they were all covered by sand. We also see the dune recession as the shoreline retreats landward, like this beach width has significantly decreased. And we also see a decline in tidal wetland extent, which is replaced by sand and open water. So this visual timeline essentially underscores the urgency of intervention. And we know that without action, we risk a full breach that could permanently alter the pond's salinity, sediment regime, and habitat structure. But we also know that will have really huge impacts to the town of Nantucket too. So let's examine closer some of the dune transects we've examined and analyzed in the past. Here we see we are at the northern side of the pond here, where we have the overwashed dunes. The blue line, this one, is the dune in 2010. We see clearly that the dune system started migrating towards the west, but we see interestingly that at that area, we have sand deposits at the backside, at the rear side of the dune. So we don't lose sand at Coskata Pond, at least at the northern side of Coskata Pond. It is being deposited at the rear side of the dunes. And of course, the dune migrate towards the west. However, this is not the case at the narrower side of the Coskata Pond. Here, we don't really have as many deposits at the rear side of the dunes as we have at the overwashed area farther north. This is the 2010 profile. This is the 2024, and this smaller one is the 2018. The dunes continue moving on shore. Less sediments are being deposited at the rear side, and this is the pond area. So we are wondering what we can do to help the system retain the overwashed sediments, build up in width, and create a more resilient and stronger system, preventing a potential breach that will definitely affect not only the peninsula and the wildlife refuge, but also the town of Nantucket. So this flood map again illustrates projected inundation scenarios for the Coskata Pond area using current and future sea level benchmarks. And like the whole over map, it's based on the mean sea level and mean high water elevation. So to address these issues, we propose again a living shoreline solution that includes oyster castles that reduce wave energy and promote sediment stability, low and high marsh restoration to rebuild the tidal wetland buffer, and active vegetation planting to stabilize dunes and support the habitat recovery. So these measures aim to establish a wider, more resilient beach profile, restore the marsh ecosystem, and reduce the risk of a breach event. So this is the proposed living shoreline that spans approximately 800 linear feet, and it integrates, as I mentioned, oyster castles, native marsh vegetation, and stable topographic enhancements to encourage the natural sediment deposition. This is the cross sections of the suggested designs. So what we see here is that the first panel shows the overall picture, different oyster castles farther onshore or offshore, active vegetation, closer view of the structures. And here we see projections of what will happen if we implement the measures. So if we implement the measures, the gray line here shows how much the slope is gonna change and how many sediments are gonna accrete in the area, because the oyster castles and the plants will help the sediments to be retained in place and not be lost. Let me go to the previous one, and not be lost farther offshore in that area, which is actually pretty deep. Because what happens now is that sand comes in either due to wave action or due to aeolian sediment transport. It comes here, but there is nothing to retain it. And then it's being transported farther west, and is being lost in the deeper waters of Coskata Pond. We want to trap it and retaining it, creating a wider beach. And this is how the 2018, actually, the red line here shows how the 2018 profile was back in the past. So if no measures are taken, we risk to have a system like 2018, even lower and lower and lower, and the narrower beach, instead of taking advantage of nature and retaining the sediments in place. So this is actually the last suggested solution. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and engagement. This work is the result of deep collaboration between scientists, conservationists, and the community. And we are excited to move forward with your input and support. So I will give it again to Alejandra to share more questions, and thanks again.
Perfect. Well,